about how Rupert Sheldrake, my husband, and I have influenced each other, and so I thought I'd actually start and to put the background of the work that I was doing before I met him, because it's very relevant to the whole story. So from a very early age, I was completely fascinated by music. My mother was a pianist, a concert pianist, and I was brought up in a house with 3 concert grounds. And I was fascinated with water. I used to spend many hours contemplating the patterns in water. And the thing that most interested me was form, how form comes into being. And when I was at university, I did a thesis on the spiral, aspirations towards eternity, and the spiral in art. And I became very fascinated about the patterns in nature and how form comes into being. And it was very clear to me that the answers were not known. You know, I remember going to the botany department at Reading and asking about all these patterns in nature, these geometrical patterns, logarithmic spirals. And he said, "Oh, we don't ask those kind of questions." And then I realized, well, that's exactly the kind of questions we have to ask. And then I went on and I wrote an article for The Structurist in 71 about this, and then I did a research fellowship in King's College with Maurice Wilkins, who was one of the 3 who got the Nobel Prize for DNA, which is one of the forms in nature that was discovered then. And then I gave a talk for him on the British Society for Responsibility in Science in his lab at about that time. And so in 71, my big question was, how does form come into being? And then I went and worked and lived with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the German composer. And he had just written a piece called Stimmung, which was a piece where 6 singers sit around and amplify the harmonics singing on one note, B flat, so that you hear them floating, the notes floating above the fundamental note, which is all based on resonance. Well, before I went, I'd been working with the Gyuto monks, who are this Tibetan college, tantric college, who particularly do this form of chanting based on resonance, based on chanting on a single note and amplifying the harmonics. And then when I was with Stockhausen, we did a piece together called Alphabet for Liège, showing the effect of sound on matter. So this preoccupation with form and sound was very key. When I came back in 74, 75, I was teaching at Chelsea College of Art and the Architectural Association, where I was doing a whole thing, time and the music of form, for example, was one of my themes. And so the themes that I was teaching were all about form, music, time, and then I realized that the most important thing of all was inducting people into using their voices, because it was all about how we use our voices ourselves. So I started in the late 70s teaching people how to work with sound to become conscious. That was my main aim. And in particular, therefore, using resonance, the extreme resonance that I'd learned about through the Tibetans at the end of the 60s and Stockhausen in 71, and realizing that really it was about extreme forms of resonance, working with the very fundamental principles of sound itself. And one of my students was a man called John Reed, who I was talking to him about my early work with kymatics, with the work of Hans Jenny, and patterns, vibratory patterns in liquids and different kinds of substances, viscosities, and so forth. And he then went away and invented something called the Cymoscope. So one of the ways that our work came round in a circle was recently Rupert and Merlin, our son, were working with got from John the Cymoscope that he had invented as a result of working with me in the 80s in order to do experiments with sound. And then another aspect of my work was is family patterns. Through the working with sound, I became absolutely fascinated with working with ancestors, patterns, family patterns, transgenerational family patterns, memory in families. And so for the last 25 years or so, I've been working with family patterns. And again, this is one of the aspects which is completely not understood in science. And so one of the people working with this, Bert Hellinger, came to work with Rupert and adopt his theory of morphic resonance in order to try to bring some kind of scientific understanding to this. And so a lot of Rupert's work is involved in trying to explain these these transgenerational family patterns through memory. And this is one of the aspects of my main work. One of the main aspects of my work is working with individuals on their and groups with family constellations. So resonance, in reality, memory, form, and in 82, Rupert and I met at a conference in Bombay, which was called Ancient Wisdom and Modern Science, where Rupert was talking about his theory and I was talking about dynamic patterns in opposites and spiral patterns and form. And that's really when we got together. So I'd been working with scientists for much of my life up to then, and I finally found a scientist who answered the questions that I was trying to answer and found nobody who understood them. So this was suddenly, here was a scientist who was actually addressing the very questions which I had found no answer to. So Rupert, there you were. You were there in person, answering the very questions which I had received a resounding silence to when I asked any other scientists. And of course we ended up getting married in 85, and I think have influenced each other ever since. I mean, my work with spiritual practices and working with sound, and more recently Rupert's 2 books on spiritual practices has very much dovetailed with my work. I don't know if you'd like to take on from here.
Well, when I met Jill in 1982, I recently published my first book, A New Science of Life, which was about morphic resonance, the idea of a memory in nature of forms of resonant structures. All structures are resonant, everything's vibratory in nature. And this memory passing across time through morphic resonance. And that was what I was talking about at the conference in Bombay. I was working in India. I'd been living in India for years, actually, and was working in an agricultural research institute, ICRISAT, in Hyderabad. I'd taken 2 or 3 days off from my harvesting work with my crop of chickpeas to go to this conference. So for me, it was a transition from literally working in the fields to a whole other world of ideas and people I hadn't met before. And one of them was Jill, and Jill was talking about forms and spirals and patterns in nature, which overlapped very much with my own interests. She was coming to it from the arts point of view and from the experiential point of view. So it was clear there was a lot of overlap there. And her work on resonance is about literal resonance, the resonance of sound and the resonance in the body, the resonance of the voice. I was using the word resonance in a somewhat more metaphorical sense. So her work on chanting and singing and the workshops she'd started doing at that time were very relevant and gave a kind of experiential pole to the work I was doing. It was somewhat more scientific and theoretical. Both of us have a musical background. I play the piano and the organ, and I come from a family of musicians, organists, and Jill comes from a family, both her father and mother were very musical. So music was a key part of overlapping interests. And then as time went on and I came to appreciate how much Jill's teaching experientially about singing and chanting changed people, that this was a spiritual practice that could be taught to people who were spiritual but not religious, or completely non-religious and non-spiritual, and people who were spiritual and religious. It could work for everybody and dealt with fundamental principles in all traditions. This showed me how the measurable scientific effects of spiritual practices can have profound transformative effects on people. And that, as Jill mentioned, resulted in my writing 2 books about spiritual practices, Science and Spiritual Practices, and Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Worked, a title that Jill suggested herself. Each book deals with 7 different spiritual practices which have been studied scientifically. And both those books represent a kind of overlap between my scientific and my spiritual interests. The Cymoscope, the apparatus for studying the patterns of standing waves, Faraday waves they're called, in vibrating fluids, brought together something, as Jill mentioned, her long-standing interest in vibration and form, and my own interests in vibration and form. And these experiments I did in the laboratory we have here in our home with our son Merlin. We published a paper in Water Journal about these, and we're writing another paper based on our findings with these experiments. So all through Jill's work, she's been interested in the nature of form, structure, and pattern. The wonderful series of books she edited for Thames and Hudson, including her own book, The Mystic Spiral, covers a wide range of traditions, spiritual and intellectual traditions dealing with form. So throughout our time together, these interests have overlapped very considerably. And quite often we've spoken at the same conferences because they overlap, so we can't fall within the same general areas of interest in these conferences. And I think actually our sons represent a remarkable synthesis of our mutual interests. Our son Merlin is a biologist and has written the book Entangled Life about fungi and the interconnectedness of nature. And he's interested in the more holistic aspects of biology. And our son Cosmo, who's a musician and composer, takes up many of these themes from Jill. So our marriage, these overlapping interests, have actually also resulted not only in our own work, enriching our own work, but are being carried on in various ways by our sons.
And then, of course, family constellations.
Yes.
Another huge part.
Yes, and family constellations, which...
such a big part of my work at the moment.
Which
last 20 years.
Family constellations, which are to do with the field of the family, fit very naturally into the idea of morphic fields, which are the organizing fields of structures at all levels of complexity, including social groups like families. The idea of morphic resonance suggests that these fields will have a kind of inherent memory given by resonance with past generations of the family. That follows from the whole theory of morphic resonance. And it turns out in the practice of family constellation work that memories are indeed carried over from generation to generation, affecting the whole pattern of the family and the family field. And that's one of the areas where our own work is, both our works are remarkably complementary, because not only Jill, but many other people working in the field of family constellation therapy think that there's a kind of memory principle that might well be explained by morphic resonance going on in these situations. And this kind of therapy is remarkably effective and profound. And I think it works so well precisely because it taps into these memories that are unconsciously present in family fields.
So our work is extraordinarily complementary and has been right from the very beginning, including our meeting at this conference, Ancient Wisdom and Modern Science. And I think it's been resonating down the years, and as Rupert says, it's very much now emerged in our two sons, Merlin and Cosmo, and their work integrating both these themes. And Cosmo's music is very much to do with the biological, he's fascinated by bird sounds and fish and flocks of fish and birds, which are, of course, is another aspect of the field, and working with creating sounds electronically. And so it's wonderful how this marriage has produced not just the mutuality in our own work and fascination with these themes of form and movement and water and vibration, but also how those have evolved in the lives of our two sons. Very fruitful marriage.